The blizzard did not arrive the way most storms did in Pine Kettle Ridge. It did not build slowly across the horizon with dark, warning clouds stacking one on top of another, like the valley had learned to read over generations. This one came sideways. It came fast and without ceremony, the way bad news always did in hard country, not announced, just suddenly present and already too late to outrun. Nora Reed had been walking for 40 minutes when the temperature dropped hard enough to feel like a physical blow across her face. One moment the air was cold. The next it was something else entirely. Something with intent. She pulled the collar of her canvas work coat higher and tucked her chin down into the wool scarf her father had given her the winter she turned 19. The wool still smelled faintly of cedar and machine oil. She had not washed it since he died. She was not sure she ever would. Drift pressed against her left leg as they moved down the wagon trail heading south. He was a medium-built cattle dog, gray and brown, with one ear that never fully stood straight, and he had been her father's dog before he became hers. That was how it worked on a working farm. Animals belonged to the land, and the labor not to any single person. But after 12 years of early mornings and long evenings, after 12 years of feeding and fencing and doctoring sick calves together in the dark, Drift had decided on his own that Nora was his person. He had made that decision quietly the way good dogs did, without drama, without negotiation. She had 14 miles to cover before reaching Caldwell Crossing. In fair weather, a person with a strong stride and good boots could make it in under 5 hours. These were not fair conditions, and her boots were already failing her. The left one had a seam separation she had meant to repair twice in the past month and never gotten around to. Water found that gap before the first mile was behind her. By the second mile, the cold had moved from her toes upward through her foot like slow rising water in a basement. She noticed the numbness the way she noticed most problems. Quietly, without panic, but with complete attention. 14 miles in a dying storm was a problem. 14 miles with wet boots and dropping temperature was a different category of problem altogether. She did not look back toward the farmhouse. She had made a decision about that before she stepped off the porch. Looking back would not change the paperwork. Looking back would not change the name that was not written on any deed, any title transfer, any piece of legal documentation her father had ever filed in his 23 years working that land. She had asked about it once, maybe 7 years ago, when she was old enough to understand how property moved between generations. Her father had looked at her the way he sometimes did when a question touched something he was not ready to speak plainly. He said he would get around to it. He said there was time. There was not time. The lung fever came in late October, 3 weeks before the first snow of the season. It took him fast, not the slow, grinding kind of sick that gives a family months to arrange themselves around the loss. The fast kind. The kind that moved from a cough to a delirium to a silence between one Friday evening and the following Tuesday morning. Nora had slept in the chair beside his bed for 4 nights straight. She had held his hand through the worst of it. She had been the one to close his eyes. She had also been the one to go out the following morning and feed the livestock, because the livestock did not understand that a man had died in the night, and their hay did not appear by sentiment. She had pitched hay and broken ice in the water troughs and checked the condition of every animal in every outbuilding, the way her father had taught her, starting at the north end and working south, missing nothing. The work had helped her in the way that work always helped people in hard country, not by making grief smaller, by giving grief something to coexist with. Ruth Reed had arrived at the farm 2 years after Nora's mother passed, when Nora was 11 years old. She was a practical woman from the eastern flatlands who understood bookkeeping and dry goods inventory better than she understood soil or livestock or the particular silence a working ranch required before dawn. She had never been cruel to Nora. That was the truth, and Nora held it honestly. Ruth had not been cruel. She had simply been separate in the way that some people were always separate, even inside the same walls, even around the same table, even after more than a decade under the same roof. There was a distance there that neither woman had ever found a way to cross, and neither had tried very hard, and now the distance had turned into something legal and permanent, and expressed in the language of widows' documents and signed property transfers. The kitchen conversation had lasted less than 10 minutes. Ruth had placed the paperwork on the table without ceremony. She had folded her hands in front of her and looked at Nora the way a person looked at a business arrangement they wished had worked out differently, but accepted had not. Your father never put your name on anything. That was what she said. She did not say it with pleasure. She said it the way hard facts usually got delivered in ranch country, directly, without softening. As if kindness in the delivery would somehow make the truth less true. Nora had looked at the papers. She had looked at her hands. Her hands that had spent 12 years repairing fences and replacing shingles and digging drainage channels and splitting wood and pulling fence posts and patching the north barn roof and doing every physical task the land demanded of a working body in every season. Her hands had known this farm better than any document. Her hands had given this place more years than Ruth had. None of that was written down anywhere. She thought about the summer she was 16 when a late storm had taken most of the north pasture fencing, and she had spent 11 days restringing wire with her father from first light to last, both of them working without complaint through sunburn and cut palms and the particular exhaustion of physical labor that did not end when the body wanted it to. She thought about the winter she was 21, when a sickness moved through the cattle herd and she and her father had barely slept for 3 weeks monitoring animals through the night, making decisions about which ones could be saved and which could not, with the cold pragmatism that ranching required of anyone who stayed in it long enough. She thought about every repair, every season, every early morning when the farm had needed something from her, and she had given it without being asked, and without keeping a ledger of what she had given. Apparently, someone else had been keeping a different kind of ledger. Ruth slid a flour sack across the table. Inside was cornmeal salt pork, a block of hard cheese, and a fold of paper money that represented what she called a fair settlement for the labor years. Nora picked up the sack. She picked up Drift's rope lead from the hook by the door. She took one wool blanket from the chest at the foot of her bed and rolled it under her arm. She did not take anything that was not clearly hers. That mattered to her in a way she could not fully explain. It simply mattered. She stepped off the porch and heard the bolt slide home behind her. The storm was already thickening by the time she reached the first fence line at the bottom of the property. Snow came horizontally in sharp, thin sheets that found every gap between her collar and her scarf, between her glove cuff and her coat sleeve. The wind had a blade to it. Not the blunt cold of an ordinary Wyoming winter, but something with an edge, something personal. The kind of wind that seemed to specifically locate whatever part of a person was most exposed and concentrate itself there. Drift kept pace beside her without complaint. That was one of the finest qualities a dog could have in rough country. Not excitement, not anxiety, just presence. Just the steady willingness to be beside you in exactly the conditions that most creatures with any good sense would refuse. He had inherited that quality from years of working alongside her father, who had possessed the same quality in himself and had apparently passed it to the dog through the long proximity of shared labor. The road south ran straight across the open valley floor for the first 3 miles before rising toward the lower passes that eventually dropped into Caldwell Crossing. In good conditions, the road was straightforward. In this storm, it was disappearing. Snow filled the wagon ruts within minutes of the wind shifting. The fence posts that marked the road's edge became vague shapes, then suggestions of shapes, then nothing at all. Nora walked by compass, and by the angle of the wind, and by the feel of the ground hardness beneath her feet, which was a skill her father had taught her during a night storm when she was 14, and which she had never stopped being grateful for. He had been specific about it, not just walk by feel, but understand why feel worked. The packed surface of a road held differently than the loose soil of a field margin. The compaction had a quality you could read through boot leather if you paid attention, rather than letting your eyes do all the work. Your eyes would fail you in a whiteout. The ground beneath your feet would not if you had learned to listen to it. Her pace was slowing. She noticed that too. Wet feet slowed a person before they felt it happening. The body kept moving, but the efficiency bled out quietly, and a quarter mile that should have taken 4 minutes started taking 6, then 8, then more. Cold did not always kill quickly. Sometimes it killed through arithmetic. Enough small losses stacked one on top of another until the sum became something that could not be recovered from. By the time she reached the second mile marker, she had lost all feeling in the first two toes of her left foot. She stopped once and crouched behind the remnant of a stone wall that a rancher had built along the road's edge decades ago. The wall broke perhaps 3 feet of wind. In that small break, she pulled her boot off with stiff hands and tucked her toes against the inside of her thigh, pressing warmth back into the foot through wool and skin. Drift pressed against her shoulder without being asked. She held the foot there for 3 minutes. Feeling returned in the painful way it did, sharp and burning and unpleasant, and she was glad for it. Pain meant circulation. Pain meant the tissue was still responsive. She pulled the boot back on and kept moving. She knew the calculus of cold the way she knew the calculus of most things that could damage a working body. You did not panic and you did not minimize. You identified the specific problem and you addressed it with the specific solution, and then you kept moving because stopping was the thing that compounded every other problem into something fatal. Her father had taught her that too in the blunt declarative way he taught everything he considered essential. Cold wants you to stop. Don't give it what it wants. The western hills were visible on clear days as a long, dark ridge of limestone and pine that broke the valley's flat monotony like a spine rising from flat ground. In the storm, they were gone. The entire western horizon had been replaced by moving white and undifferentiated field of blowing snow that swallowed distance and direction and the usual landmarks a person navigated by instinct. The valley that she had lived in and worked in for 27 years had ceased to be recognizable. The storm had replaced it with something featureless and new and entirely indifferent to the fact that she was walking through it. Drift stopped. Not a stumble, not a hesitation. A complete stop, both front feet planted, head turned away from the road and toward the western hills that were invisible in the whiteout. His ears angled forward. The ear that never stood straight was as straight as it was ever going to get. Nora stopped beside him. She looked where he was looking. She saw nothing but storm. "Come on," she said. Her voice came out rough and thin in the cold, barely carrying past her own face. She tugged the rope. Drift did not move. He stood with every ounce of his body oriented toward the invisible west, and the muscles along his back carried a tension she recognized. She had seen it before the times he had caught a scent she could not and refused to move until she acknowledged that he had found something worth acknowledging. She tugged the rope again harder this time. Drift planted himself with the stubborn completeness that only dogs and mules and very old men could truly achieve. He did not pull against her. He simply declined to go the direction she was pointing. He turned his head and looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated communication of an animal that had run out of subtler signals. Then he turned back toward the west and let out a low sound that was not quite a bark, more like a statement. Nora stood still for a long moment. The road south led to warmth and walls and people who might help. The road south was the logical direction, the known quantity, the thing that made sense when sense was what you reached for. The hills to the west were invisible. They were off-road and off-plan, and they led away from any destination she had been walking toward. A person with full sensation in both feet and a dry coat and daylight remaining made a different calculation than a person standing where Nora was standing. She thought about her father, not a sentimental thought, a practical one. He had trusted this dog more times than she could count. He had said once with the economy of a man who did not waste words on things he considered obvious, that Drift had better judgment than most people he had met, and he had met a fair number of people in his time. He had said it without irony and without apology, and Nora had understood it was not a comment on people so much as an acknowledgement that certain animals had a relationship with the world that human beings had largely traded away for the comfort of assuming they already knew what was there. Nora stepped off the road. The ground changed immediately. Away from the compacted surface of the wagon trail, the snow was deeper and uneven, hiding the irregular ground of the valley floor beneath it. She sank to mid-calf with her first step. The second was worse. But Drift moved ahead of her now with purpose, threading between drifts and depressions with the confidence of an animal following something she could not detect, and she kept his rope taut and followed his line as closely as she could. The western hills rose gradually and without mercy. What looked from the road like a gentle slope proved to be a series of limestone shelves covered in snow, each one requiring her to lift her feet higher than her burning legs wanted to cooperate with. The pine trees came first as sounds before she could see them, the way the wind changed pitch and direction when it moved through needled branches rather than across open ground. Then they materialized from the white as dark masses. Old growth pine that had been holding this ridge against the wind for longer than any living person could remember. The wind was different here, still brutal, still cold, but interrupted. The trees broke the horizontal drive of it and redirected it into something more confused and less lethal. She could feel the difference in her face within a few steps of the first trees. The razor quality of the exposed valley wind gave way to something that still wanted to kill her, but was no longer as organized about it. She could breathe without wincing. Drift kept climbing. She climbed with him because there was no reasonable alternative, and because something had committed itself in her chest the moment she stepped off the road. Not hope exactly. Hope was a luxury for people with more options than she currently had. It was something simpler. The recognition that she had trusted this animal before, and the results had been worth trusting him for. And this was not the moment to start second-guessing a track record that had never once failed her in 12 years of shared work. They topped the first rise, and the ground leveled briefly into a small natural terrace before the limestone shoulder of the ridge rose more steeply ahead. Drift stopped here. He put his nose down against the snow and began to dig with both front paws, throwing snow backward between his legs in quick, urgent strokes. Nora watched him for a moment. Then she came closer. She crouched beside him and looked at what he was digging toward. Snow had drifted against the hillside several feet deep at this point, packed and hard near the surface, where repeated wind had compressed it. Drift dug past the surface layer and hit something that made a different sound. Not rock, not frozen earth. Something with a slight hollow resonance when his paws struck it. She reached past him and pressed her palm against the spot he had cleared. Wood. Not fallen timber, not a root, not any natural thing. The grain ran in a direction that wood did not run when trees grew. Straight across. Planed. Cut. She started clearing snow with both hands working alongside Drift, with a focused efficiency that she recognized as the cold side of desperation. Her fingers were past feeling, but they worked anyway because the alternative was to stop working, and she was not ready to accept the alternative. Snow came away in chunks and sheets. The wooden surface expanded as she cleared it. Then the edge of the wood appeared, and with the edge came the unmistakable geometry that nature never produced without assistance. A right angle. She sat back on her heels for a moment, breathing hard in the cold, and looked at what her hands had found. A door. Heavy timber plank built and cross-braced with iron straps that had darkened to the color of dried blood with age. Iron hinges on the left side. An iron pull handle on the right, shaped in a simple loop frozen over, but intact. The door was set directly into the hillside at a slight angle, and the frame around it had been built with limestone blocks that had settled into the slope so thoroughly over the years that they looked like part of the hill itself. If the snow had covered it any more completely, if Drift had not stopped exactly where he stopped, Nora would have walked within 6 feet of this door and never known it was there. She sat with her hand on the iron handle for several seconds. A root cellar was possible. A collapsed mine entry was possible. An animal den with a long history of accumulated debris blocking the inner passage was possible. A grave dug horizontally into a hill by someone who had needed to bury more than the ground could hold vertically in frozen winter was also possible. Country like this held many things that were not advertised. She looked at Drift. He was sitting beside the door now, no longer digging. His body relaxed his tail, making a single slow movement. He had found what he came to find. The decision was hers. Nora grabbed the handle with both hands, planted her feet in the snow, and pulled. The hinges resisted with the sound of iron that had not moved in a long time, a grinding protest that she felt through her palms more than heard through the wind. She pulled harder, leaning her body weight backward, and the door moved. Barely. An inch. Then two. Then a crack opened along the frame, and through that crack came something that stopped her thoughts completely. Not cold air. Air from underground was never as cold as surface air in deep winter. This was simply different. The air that slipped through the crack was dry. Still, it carried the smell of packed earth and old wood and something faintly smoky. The ghost of fires burned long enough ago that only the idea of smoke remained rather than the thing itself. She shoved the door open another 6 inches and pressed her face close. Darkness inside. Not the impenetrable darkness of a sealed space, but the darkness of a space that had depth, that extended further than the opening let on. A breath of underground air moved steadily outward through the gap, not forcefully, but with the quiet consistency of a place that had its own air pressure, its own internal environment that had been holding itself separate from the mountain winter outside for a very long time. She got the door open far enough to pass through. She reached back for Drift's rope, found it, and pulled him inside ahead of her. Then she hauled the door shut behind them with both hands, and the world ended. The blizzard stopped. Not reduced, not muffled, stopped. The roar that had been the constant backdrop to every moment of the past 2 hours simply ceased. The way sound ceased when a door sealed against it, which was exactly what had happened. But the psychological impact of it was something she was not prepared for. She stood in the darkness with her back against the closed door and the silence pressed against her ears like something physical. Drift shook snow from his coat. The sound of it was almost loud. Nora found matches in her coat pocket by feel, 3 of them wrapped in wax paper the way her father had taught her. The first match lit on the second strike. The small flame revealed stone steps descending into the hill at a moderate grade, 10 steps visible before the darkness swallowed them. Cedar support beams lined both sides of a passage that was wider than she expected, easily wide enough for 2 people to pass. The walls were packed earth shored with more cedar, and they were dry. She touched the wall with her free hand. Dry. Not merely not wet. Genuinely carefully dry in a way that required intentional design to achieve. The match burned down to her fingers. She lit the second. She went down. The tunnel ran approximately 20 feet before the ceiling rose, and the walls spread, and the passage opened without warning into a chamber that made her stop walking entirely. She held the match up and turned slowly. Shelves. Floor to ceiling on 3 walls, hand-built from rough-cut lumber reinforced at the joints with iron brackets that had been installed with the care of someone who understood load-bearing. The shelves were not empty. Glass jars filled the upper rows, dozens of them sealed with wax rings in a deep amber color that suggested rendered fat rather than paraffin. Strips of dried meat hung from iron hooks set into the ceiling beams above the central area, each strip separated from its neighbor, allowing air circulation. Barrels stood along the far wall, 6 of them resting on limestone blocks raised 4 inches above the earth floor, each one sealed with waxed cloth pressed under a fitted lid. At the center of the chamber stood a small cast iron stove. It was not large, but it was positioned with precision, backed against a thick section of limestone wall that rose from floor to ceiling at the rear of the space, a thermal mass that Nora recognized from the construction logic her father had explained to her once when they were rebuilding the stone fireplace in the old bunkhouse. The stone would absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. It would not heat the room quickly, but it would keep it from dying all the way down to freezing in the hours between fires. Beside the stove sat a canvas-covered stack. She pulled the canvas back. Cedar firewood split to stove length, dry and pale. She pressed her face close and breathed in. The cedar smell was still strong enough to be distinct. This wood had not been here so long that it lost its character. Her second match died. She stood in the dark for a moment. Then she found the last match. She used it to locate a stub of candle sitting on the edge of the nearest shelf, held in a clay dish with an indentation that fit a candle base. She lit it. The candle was nearly half burned down, which meant someone had used this place within the last year or 2 at most. The wax was still soft enough to give slightly when she pressed her thumbnail against it. Drift crossed the chamber slowly, nose working the floor in long, sweeping movements. He circled the stove, once examined the food shelves from a distance with professional interest, then chose a spot against the limestone wall behind the stove and settled himself onto the earth floor with the slow, deliberate descent of a tired animal who had made a decision about where he was going to sleep and was now executing that decision. Nora moved through the space with careful deliberateness. She opened one jar from the lower shelf. Navy beans packed in their own liquid, sealed tight. No frost crystals on the inside of the glass, no discoloration, no smell of spoilage. When she cracked the wax and eased the lid up slightly, she closed it again. She checked the barrels. The nearest one shifted with a liquid sound when she rocked it gently. Grain not yet frozen solid. The limestone blocks raising the barrels off the floor had kept ground frost from wicking upward through the wood. She inspected the stovepipe where it connected to the firebox, then followed its angle upward toward the ceiling, where it disappeared into a mortared channel in the limestone. No obvious separation, no visible collapse. She went to the stove door and opened it. Dry ash inside, which told her the last fire had burned completely without moisture interfering, which told her the draft had been working when that fire was last used. Old ash. Maybe 2 seasons old, maybe 3, but the pipe was intact. She fed kindling first. Thin cedar splits from the bottom of the stack, the pieces that had been drying the longest. She fed them into the firebox in a small pyramid, the way her father had shown her, creating a draft space beneath the fuel. Then she held the candle flame to the base of the kindling and waited. The fire caught. She heard the draft engage almost immediately, that particular sound a wood stove made when the pipe temperature rose enough for convection to begin pulling properly, a low, hollow rush of air moving upward through the channel. The kindling took and she fed 2 small splits over it and closed the firebox door most of the way, leaving a half-inch gap for primary air, and watched the temperature gauge on the stove door begin its slow movement from the cold side of the dial. Smoke moved upward where it belonged. She sat back on her heels and let herself feel it, the very first edge of warmth coming off the iron surface, barely perceptible at this stage, more of a reduction in cold than an actual presence of heat, but real, measurable, the beginning of the kind of warmth that accumulated rather than faded. Nora pulled her boots off. Her left foot was pale and waxy at the toes, that particular color that was several steps past normal cold and heading towards something more serious. She held the foot between her palms and pressed warmth into it from her own blood, and the pain that came back with circulation was bad enough to make her jaw tight, but she held it and kept holding it because pain returning was better than pain not returning. Drift lifted his head and watched her work. When feeling was restored to the satisfaction that she could wiggle all 5 toes independently without numbness remaining, she set her boots near the stove at a careful distance, close enough for the heat to begin working on the soaked leather, far enough that the leather would not crack from sudden heat applied to material that was not ready for it. She ate. She opened a jar of navy beans and ate half of it cold with a piece of hard rye bread she found wrapped in oilcloth on the second shelf. She ate slowly, paying attention to the food the way a person paid attention to it when they had recently understood that having it was not guaranteed. Salt pork from the ceiling hook, sliced thin with the small knife she carried in her coat pocket. The meal was plain to the edge of austerity. She did not care. The body did not require pleasure in desperate circumstances. It required fuel. Only after eating did she let herself examine the rest of the chamber. The shelving extended into a second alcove behind the main room, separated by a low stone archway she had to duck through. Back here, the storage continued, more barrels, more canvas-covered stacks, a coil of thick rope hanging on a wooden peg, a set of iron tools including an axe, a mattock, and a long-handled trenching spade. Hanging from a horizontal peg near the ceiling was a set of snowshoes, the old bent willow kind with rawhide webbing that had dried to stiffness but appeared intact. Against the back wall of the alcove on a shelf at chest height, she found the ledger. It was wrapped in canvas, treated with something that had kept moisture from penetrating for a long time. She unwrapped it carefully. The cover was thick leather, dark brown, nearly to black with age, and pressed into it in letters that had been made with a leather stamp were two words: Ecroft. She carried it back to the main chamber. She sat near the stove where the heat was beginning to accumulate into something she could properly call warmth. She opened the ledger by the candlelight and began to read. The first pages were practical, written in the dense, compressed hand of a man who understood that paper was not infinite and that words should carry weight commensurate with the space they occupied. Daily temperature observations. Snow depth measurements taken at a specific point outside the shelter entrance. Wood consumption by the stick. Food inventory updates written in shorthand that took her several pages to fully decode. But the picture assembled itself. Elias Croft, freight station keeper, Northern Passes above Pine Kettle Ridge. The winter of 1873, which he referred to in the ledger as the Blue Darkness, a name she had not heard before, but which conveyed its meaning without explanation. He had kept two men alive that winter through the worst of it. He wrote about them by initials only J, H, and TW, which suggested either privacy or respect or both. She turned the pages slowly. Elias had not been a man who wasted ink on sentiment any more than he wasted space on the page. Every entry was functional. Temperatures, quantities, observations about what the cold did to specific materials under specific conditions. Notes on what had worked and what had not worked, and what the difference between the two had been and why. It was the ledger of the man who had decided that precision was the appropriate response to a world that did not forgive imprecision. Then she found the page that stopped her. It was not marked differently from the others. It did not announce itself. She almost turned past it. But a line near the bottom of the page caught her eye because the writing pressure was different there, pressed harder than the surrounding text, as if the hand that wrote it had needed the added force to get the words out. The first shelter failed. March of '73. Bad draft. Bad design. One man did not wake from sleep. I did not write his name here because I cannot write it without burning the page. Nora sat very still. She read the sentence again. Then she turned to the next page. He rebuilt it himself. He drew the plans himself. He calculated the air volume, the heat requirement, the food storage mass, the drainage angles. He spent the summer of 1873 in the Hill with a pick and a mattock and a determination that he described in the ledger as the only response available to a man who needed to understand why something failed so that the failure would not happen again. This shelter was not the original. The original had killed someone. This shelter was the lesson. She turned pages more slowly now. Elias had continued using the shelter through the winters of 1874 and 1875, making refinements with each season. The drainage trench in the rear alcove, the secondary ventilation opening he had positioned to create cross-circulation through the deeper rooms. The decision to raise all barrel storage on stone blocks after he watched moisture wick upward through wood flooring in a surface building and ruin an entire grain supply in a single thaw cycle. He had tested every assumption against reality and revised every assumption that reality contradicted. Near the back third of the ledger, the entries became less frequent and more philosophical. A man who had spent years in close observation of how winter moved and what it actually required of any structure that meant to survive it, had developed opinions about the nature of the problem that went beyond the technical. He had begun to understand winter not as an enemy to be defeated, but as a condition to be understood, and the understanding was more useful than the opposition. One line sat alone on a page near the middle of the ledger. Cabins lose heat because winter touches every wall. She read it twice. Then she looked up at the walls around her, the earth and stone that did not expose themselves to the wind in any direction that presented no surface to the storm above. Elias had understood something that most men built against their instincts to resist. The answer to winter was not bigger walls. The answer was fewer walls. The answer was depth. She turned more pages. The entries near the end of the ledger were shorter. The hand was the same, but something in the compression of the writing suggested a man finishing a record rather than continuing one. Then she reached the final entry. It was dated March 1876. The writing here was different again, slower, more deliberate, as if each word had been considered fully before it was committed to the paper. I leave this place as I found the problem that created it, completely. Whatever man or woman reads this in a winter, I will not see the shelter works, because it was built by someone who first understood why it failed. That is the only knowledge worth passing forward, not what survived. Why? Below that, in different ink written on a different day, by the change in color and consistency, was a single additional line. The earth keeps what it covers better than men keep what they own. Nora closed the ledger. She sat with it across her knees for a long time, while the stove settled into its working rhythm behind her, and the heat began reaching the far edges of the chamber. The candle flame stood straight and undisturbed. No draft reached it here. No wind found the walls. The storm that had been trying to kill her an hour ago was still running itself against the outside of this hill, still throwing everything it had at the Wyoming winter night. She could hear nothing of it. Drift was already asleep. His breathing was slow and deep, the breathing of an animal that had done what it came to do and was now at rest without reservation or qualification. Nora looked around the chamber one more time. The shelves, the stove, the dry walls, the precision of everything that had been placed here, arranged not for convenience but for function, not for comfort but for survival. A man she would never meet had sat in a grief she could only imagine in the spring of a terrible winter, with one dead man on his conscience and his memory. And he had decided that the only acceptable response was to understand exactly what had gone wrong and build something that would not go wrong in the same way again. She thought about the farm above the valley, about the paperwork on the kitchen table, about 12 years of work that had not found its way into any document. Then she opened the ledger to the last page. She found a stub of carpenter's pencil in the same shelf niche where she had found the candle. She turned to the blank page at the very back of the ledger, the page that Elias Croft had apparently left empty, and she wrote one line. "I found this place. I will keep it." She put the pencil down. She added a piece of cedar to the fire. She pulled her blanket around her shoulders and leaned back against the warm limestone wall, with Drift breathing steadily 3 feet away. Outside, the blizzard continued its long, irrational argument with the ridge. Inside the hill, the warmth held. The second day underground passed with the particular quiet of a place that had decided to hold itself apart from the world above it. Nora woke before full light, or what passed for light down here, the gradual shift from complete darkness to the dim amber of a candle she had let burn low through the night. The stove had cooled to warm iron rather than hot, not cold, not failed. Just settled into this patient state of a fire that had been banked correctly rather than fed too much or abandoned too completely. She lay still for several minutes before moving. That was something her father had taught her in cold conditions. Let the body inventory itself before demanding it perform. She moved her toes first. Left foot the one that had worried her. All 5 responded slow and stiff, but present no waxy numbness, no absence of sensation that would have meant damage overnight. She breathed out slowly and sat up. Drift was already awake, sitting near the entrance tunnel, with his ears forward watching the door at the top of the stairs. He was not growling. He was not tense. He was simply watching with the professional attention of an animal that understood the distinction between a door that opened onto safety and a door that opened onto the world, and considered it worth monitoring. Nora added cedar to the stove before anything else. Small pieces first feeding onto the coals that had held through the night in the gray and orange way. Good hardwood coals held, and within a few minutes the fire was working again. The draft engaging with that familiar low rush that she was already beginning to associate with security in a way she had not expected to feel about the sound of a stovepipe. She ate from the jar of navy beans she had opened the night before, finishing what remained with a strip of salt pork and water. She melted from snow she had brought in from just inside the tunnel entrance. Packing a small pot she found hanging on an iron hook near the stove. The snow melt tasted of minerals and cold, and the faint ghost of the cedar that lined the tunnel walls. She drank it without complaint. Then she went to work. The problem with warmth in an underground shelter was the same problem her father had described years ago when they were building the stone root cellar behind the main house. Warmth without movement became stagnation. Stagnation became moisture. Moisture became the thing that destroyed every material surface it contacted slowly and completely, and without the dramatic announcement that other kinds of damage made. You did not see moisture working. You saw the result weeks later. When the grain had hardened in its sack, and the wood had softened along its grain, and the food you had counted on to carry you through the worst of the season had become something else entirely. She took the ledger from the shelf and read the relevant sections again while standing beside the stove. Elias had written about the ventilation system in the specific language of someone who had learned it through failure rather than theory. The main shaft above the stove pulled combustion gases up and out, but there was a secondary opening smaller positioned at the lower rear of the shelter behind the alcove that Elias described as the intake. Without both operating correctly, the shelter breathed in only one direction, in a space that could only exhale eventually choked on itself. She found the secondary vent in the rear alcove after 20 minutes of careful looking. It was set low in the wall behind the leftmost barrel masked by shadow and by the accumulated drift of dust and debris from years of disuse. A wooden plug had been fitted into the outer end of the shaft. She worked it free with the flat of her knife blade and immediately felt the difference. A slow, cool, clean movement of outside air that entered at the floor level and moved across the chamber in a low invisible current toward the warmth of the stove. The air shifted. The room came alive in a way that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with circulation. What had been still became intentional. What had been closed became connected to the outside world in exactly the controlled measure that Elias had designed it to be. She spent the rest of the morning on the drainage trench. Elias had described it in the ledger with the detail of someone who considered it the most important single feature of the design. The narrow channel cut along the base of the rear wall that carried ground moisture away from the storage area and toward a sump he had dug into the lowest corner of the alcove. The trench had partially collapsed along its middle section, packed earth, slowly reclaiming the channel over years of disuse. She used the trenching spade from the tool wall to reopen it, working carefully to avoid undermining the wall footing. Cutting the channel back to its original depth and clearing the debris into a pile, she moved to the far corner. When she was finished, the floor of the alcove was noticeably drier to the touch. The difference was not dramatic. But in a shelter where every percentage point of moisture was a variable that could compound over weeks, not dramatic was still meaningful. On the afternoon of the second day, she reorganized the food storage. Not because it had been stored badly. Elias had organized it with obvious intelligence. But some of the materials had shifted over the years. Barrels rolled slightly from their stone footings. Canvas covers loosened at their ties. Jars worked to positions where their neighbors pressed against them. She went through every shelf, systematically noting what was present, estimating quantity, assessing condition. She moved 3 barrels back onto their stone blocks. She retied the canvas covers. She arranged the jar inventory by the legibility of the wax seal dates Elias had pressed into the tops with a hand stamp. Oldest jars moved to the front of each row for first use, newer ones behind. She counted everything twice and wrote the inventory in the back of the ledger with the carpenter's pencil. It took 2 full pages in her small, careful hand. When she was finished, she had a complete picture of what the shelter contained and what that supply could sustain and for how long, under what conditions. The math was solid. As long as she was the only person in the shelter and the storm lasted no more than 3 weeks, she had sufficient food to remain underground with margin remaining. She was not naive enough to believe the storm would last no more than 3 weeks, or that she would remain the only person in the shelter. By evening of the second day, Nora understood something she had not fully understood when she arrived. The shelter did not run itself. It had been built with enough intelligence that it could persist through years of disuse without catastrophic failure, but persistence was not the same as function. Function required someone inside it who understood what it was trying to do and helped it do that thing consistently. Elias had written about it in one of the later ledger entries in language that was spare even by his standards. A shelter is only as good as the person maintaining it. The design prevents accidents. The person prevents the rest. She read that line 3 times. She understood it on the first reading. She read it again because understanding something and feeling the weight of it were two different things, and she wanted to feel it fully before the situation required her to act on it. The third day brought the first visitor. She heard the sound while adding a midday piece of wood to the fire. Not wind. The wind had a continuous quality against the hill that she had learned to filter as background. This was intermittent, rhythmic, coming from the direction of the door at the top of the tunnel stairs. Drift heard it before the pattern fully resolved itself in her mind. He was on his feet with his nose toward the tunnel entrance, his body language carrying none of the relaxed quality of the past 2 days. Something specific was up there, something that had weight and intention and was communicating it through the door with a sound that when she finally climbed the stairs and pressed her ear to the timber, she recognized as a fist striking wood. She opened the door with her shoulder braced behind it against the wind. The cold hit her face with the quality of something personal, the way extreme cold always felt as though it had selected her specifically. Snow had drifted against the door on the outside and spilled across the threshold as the opening widened. Beyond the threshold stood two figures. The older one was a woman somewhere in her late 60s, wrapped in a long wool coat that had accumulated so much ice along its surface that the fabric had stiffened into something closer to a shell. She held the younger one against her with one arm, a girl small, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, whose head was tucked against the older woman's side and who was not moving under her own motivation in any visible way. The older woman looked at Nora through eyes that had developed the particular flatness that extreme cold and extreme exhaustion produced in a person who was still functional but had used almost everything they had to reach the point of being functional. "We saw the smoke," she said. Her voice came out with the fragmented quality of a jaw that was working against significant muscle resistance. "Thought maybe it was hunters." Nora stepped back. She did not ask questions. She did not assess the situation any further than she already had. She simply stepped back into the side and made the opening available and said, "Come down." The woman moved with the girl pressed against her. They came down the tunnel steps with the careful movement of people whose bodies were operating on the final reserves and knew it. When they reached the chamber floor, the older woman stopped and looked around with an expression that went through several stages in rapid succession. Confusion, then recognition that the confusion was warranted, then something approaching the edge of a response. She was not going to allow herself yet. Drift approached the girl first. He moved slowly without urgency, keeping his body low and his approach angle off-center the way he approached animals that were cold and frightened, which was not unlike the way he approached people in the same condition. He pressed himself gently against the girl's legs from the side and simply stood there. Nora guided them toward the stove. She pulled the canvas from the low storage bench near the limestone wall and helped the older woman get the girl seated. The girl's gloves were rigid, not just stiff with cold, rigid in the way that meant the moisture inside the fabric had frozen and the fabric had lost its independent flexibility. Nora worked them off carefully, easing each finger free rather than pulling, because pulling at that temperature could damage tissue that had not yet been assessed. The girl's hands were pale, not white, pale, the color that sat one step back from the color that required immediate intervention, but close enough to that step that Nora moved with speed she did not advertise. She wrapped both hands in the dry wool of her own blanket and held them between her own palms, pressing body heat directly into the child's skin, and watched the color. The older woman sat beside the girl and worked at her own coat fastenings with hands that were shaking with the deep cellular tremor of someone who had been cold for longer than comfort allowed. She got the coat open eventually. Beneath it, she was wearing 3 layers, which had kept her closer to functional than the girl whose single coat had not been enough for however long they had been outside. "My name is Agnes Waller," the woman said, as if introductions were the appropriate next formality, and she intended to maintain appropriate formality regardless of circumstances. "That is my granddaughter, Wren. We came from the Lower Creek cabins. The stovepipe collapsed yesterday morning. We tried to stay, but by nightfall, the interior temperature was no longer survivable." Nora looked at her briefly. "Nora Reed," she nodded toward the shelves. "There is food. Take what you need when you are ready for it." Agnes Waller looked at the shelves the way a person looked at something that contradicted their current model of what was possible. She looked at the dry walls, the steady fire, the warm air that was not fighting to stay warm, but simply was warm in the settled way of a space that had been accumulating heat long enough for the stone to hold it independently of the fire. She looked at all of it with the expression of a woman who was accustomed to managing hard situations through competence, and who was currently confronting a situation that was beyond the range of what she had been competent to manage, and who was experiencing the precise emotional response that produced. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at them for a moment. Then Wren's hands moved. Not much. The fingers flexed slightly against the pressure of Nora's palms, a small involuntary motion that was the body's first response when circulation began returning to tissue that had been cold enough to consider surrendering the effort. The girl made a sound, short, sharp, the particular vocalization that accompanied the specific pain of feeling coming back into extremities that had been without it. Agnes Waller's composure ended at that sound. She pressed both hands over her face and her shoulders moved with the deep, involuntary movement of someone releasing something they had been holding compressed for a very long time. She did not make much noise. She was not that kind of person. But the shaking of her shoulders was complete and honest, and she did not try to stop it. Nora held Wren's hands and said nothing. Some moments did not require words, and inserting words into them was a failure of attention. She kept her palms pressed against the child's hands and watched the color return the way color returned when the body remembered what it was supposed to do gradually from the base of the fingers outward toward the tips, the pale giving way to a pink that was first faint and then real. By evening, more people had found the shelter. The smoke from the vent above the hill had been visible to anyone in the valley who was looking for it, and in the conditions that had settled over Black Hollow, everyone was looking for something. A trapper named Gideon Falk arrived an hour after Agnes and Wren, his ears so badly frostbitten that the upper cartilage had taken on a dark color that concerned Nora significantly. He said nothing when he entered the chamber. He sat near the stove and pressed both hands over his ears and breathed with the slow deliberateness of a man relearning something he had briefly forgotten how to do. She treated his ears the way she treated Wren's hands. Slow warmth applied from palms rather than direct heat. No fire, no hot water, nothing that moved faster than tissue could tolerate at the margin between survivable and not. Gideon sat through it without complaint, which told her something about the kind of man he was and also about how much the cold had taken from him before he reached the door. After Gideon came a husband and wife from the north side of the creek bed, Clarence and Mabel Pruitt, who had lost their stovepipe to the same ice accumulation that had taken Agnes Waller's. They brought a canvas bag with some of their own food hardtack and dried corn and a small amount of coffee that Mabel held with both hands, as if it were a significant object, which in the circumstances it was. Clarence had a hand-cut piece of pine with him, a board he had pulled from his front porch on the way out, which he offered to the woodpile with a practicality that Nora respected immediately. A man who thought to bring a board to a woodpile in the middle of evacuating his home in a blizzard was a man who was going to be useful. She organized them as they arrived, not with formal authority, with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood what the space required and communicated that understanding through action rather than direction. Sleeping positions along the outer walls where body heat stabilized throughout the night. Wet outer garments hung near the entrance tunnel rather than near the food shelves where moisture could work into sealed containers. Fire fed in small intervals, never large loads, because large loads produced temperature spikes that created condensation on the stone walls and loaded the air with moisture that had nowhere useful to go. She checked the ventilation shafts morning and evening. She inspected the drainage trench daily. She monitored the food stores with the ledger open to Elias's inventory notes, cross-referencing his original quantities against what remained after years of disuse and what had been consumed since she arrived. The math was not alarming yet, but it was a math that required watching. People in the shelter began to take their cues from her without anyone discussing the arrangement. Agnes Waller, once she had recovered enough to be useful, took over the organization of meal preparation, with the decisive efficiency of a woman who had spent decades managing households under difficult conditions and considered this merely an unusual extension of that skill set. Clarence Pruitt helped Gideon Falk with the stove management during the overnight hours when Nora slept. Mabel Pruitt sat with Wren during the days occupying the girl with whatever activities a small underground chamber offered, which were limited but sufficient for a child who had recently been very cold and was now not cold, and considered that an improvement worth being calm about. On the fifth evening, Nora was in the rear alcove checking the barrel moisture levels when she heard the knock at the outer door. She climbed the stairs and opened it. The man standing outside was large, well-dressed compared to everyone else who had arrived wearing a heavy sheepskin coat that had kept him substantially warmer than most, and carrying two heavy canvas bags that clinked with the sound of jarred goods. He introduced himself as Harlan Voss, said he ran a dry goods operation out of a building on the south end of Caldwell Crossing that the storm had partially disabled, and that he had made his way to the shelter after the smoke from the vent became visible from the road. Nora let him in. For the first 2 days, Harlan Voss was an acceptable presence. He was competent with his hands and helped with several practical tasks, including a crack that had developed in the mortar around one of the stovepipe brackets, which he repacked with a material he carried in one of his bags. He was not unfriendly. He was not aggressive. He occupied space with the particular confidence of a man accustomed to being the most commercially resourceful person in any room and finding that quality sufficient for most situations. He asked questions about the shelter that struck Nora as slightly more interested in ownership than in function. Who built this? How long had it been here? Whether anyone had made a formal claim to the property. She answered what was relevant and did not engage with what was not. He did not push further. Not on those days. On the third day of his stay, Nora noticed something that she did not immediately interpret correctly. The food inventory was not matching her counts. She had been running the inventory on a 2-day cycle, counting the same reference items each time to track consumption rate against the known population of the shelter. The count was off, not by much. 3 jars of the preserved beans, 2 bundles of dried apple from the ceiling hooks, a quantity of salt pork she estimated at roughly 4 portions. Not enough to represent the entire population's consumption over the period since her last count. Enough to represent one person eating separately from the communal supply. She did not say anything that evening. The following morning, she rose before anyone else was awake. She took the candle and moved through the shelter, slowly checking the areas that were in shadow during normal activity. In the furthest corner of the rear alcove, behind the last barrel, and stacked beneath a piece of canvas that had not been in that position during her reorganization, she found the cache. 11 jars, the dried apple bundles, the salt pork wrapped separately. She stood there for a moment looking at it. She understood what she was seeing with complete clarity, and she understood what it meant for the calculations she had been running on the food supply. And she understood what it meant for the people in the shelter who had been receiving reduced portions from the communal stock, while one person had been quietly building a private reserve at their expense. Then she carried the candle back to the main chamber and sat near the stove and waited for people to wake up. When Harlan Voss emerged from his sleeping area and moved toward the alcove with the casual purpose of a man who had established a private arrangement he expected to continue, Nora spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not move from where she was sitting. She simply said clearly and without drama, "I found the cache this morning." Voss stopped. He turned and looked at her with the expression of a man recalculating. "I want you to bring everything back out and put it on the main shelf," she said. "Now, before breakfast." He looked at her for a moment with the assessment that certain men performed on women who had just directly contradicted something they had decided, the calculation of whether the woman understood what kind of man she was speaking to and whether that knowledge would cause her to revise her position. Nora looked back at him without revision. "You don't have any authority here," Voss said. "This shelter doesn't belong to anyone. Nobody appointed you anything." She stood up. She picked up the ledger from the shelf beside the stove. She turned to the inventory page she had been maintaining since her arrival, the one that listed every item in the shelter by category, quantity, and location. She held it up so the full chamber could see it. Agnes Waller was awake. Clarence and Mabel Pruitt were awake. Gideon Falk was awake. Wren was awake, watching from her spot near the limestone wall with the direct attention children gave to things they understood were important. "This is a full inventory of everything in this shelter," Nora said, speaking to the room rather than to Voss specifically. "I have been counting it every 2 days since I arrived. Yesterday's count was short by 11 jars, 2 bundles of dried apple, and 4 portions of salt pork. I found those items in the rear alcove this morning under canvas." She looked at Voss. "The shelter has enough food to carry everyone here for 3 weeks at current population and current ration levels. That math changes if any portion of the supply is being removed from the communal inventory. It changes in a way that could hurt people who are already in a difficult position." She set the ledger down. "Bring the food back to the main shelf." The silence in the chamber lasted perhaps 15 seconds. Then Clarence Pruitt stood up from his sleeping area without a word and walked to the rear alcove. The sound of jars being moved came back through the archway. He reappeared with 3 jars in each hand and set them on the main shelf. He went back and returned with more. He made 3 trips. He did not look at Voss during any of them. When the shelf was restocked, Nora sat back down. Voss stood for a moment in the center of the chamber with the particular stillness of a man who had been publicly corrected in front of witnesses and was deciding what that meant for his self-conception. Then he sat down. He did not leave. He did not argue further. He ate his ration at the common meal that morning with the rest of the people in the shelter, and he did not attempt to establish a separate arrangement again. Whatever he had intended to build here, the public accounting had made it impossible to continue, and he had enough practical intelligence to recognize that. The shelter continued. On the morning of the 7th day, Nora heard a knock that was different from the others, heavier, more deliberate. The knock of someone who had been trained to knock on doors in official capacities and carried that training into every door they encountered. She opened it. Earl Dodd stood on the snow-covered hillside with the particular expression of a man who had spent the past week riding in conditions that had systematically disassembled his assumptions about what was possible and was currently operating in the cognitive state that followed that kind of extended dismantling. He was a deputy out of Caldwell Crossing. She knew of him by name and description, if not personally. A man in his mid-50s with the physical quality of someone who had spent decades doing outdoor work and whose body reflected that history in its weight and posture. Behind him stood 2 horses with ice in their manes. One of them was carrying a second rider, a woman bundled so completely in blankets and an overcoat that only her face was visible, pale and drawn with a cough that reached Nora even through the wind. Dodd looked at the door. He looked at the hillside. He looked at the vent pipe above him, from which smoke rose in a thin, controlled line against the gray sky. He looked back at the door. "So this is the place," he said. Nora stepped back. "Come down." He left the horses tied to a pine root above the entrance and carried his wife down the tunnel stairs with the careful movement of a man transporting something he could not afford to damage. He settled her near the stove with the blanket still wrapped around her and turned to Nora with the evaluating look of a man whose profession required him to quickly assess situations he had not been briefed on. She walked him through the shelter. Not a tour, an orientation. The food inventory, the ventilation system, the drainage management, the sleeping arrangement, logic, the fire discipline. She showed him the ledger and explained the origin of the shelter without editorializing. She told him about the cash incident and how it had been resolved. She told him the population count in the current ration calculation and the estimated duration of the remaining supplies. Dodd listened with complete attention. He asked 2 questions, both practical about the stovepipe condition and the water supply situation. She answered both directly. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your father used to talk about this ridge," he said. Nora looked at him. Dodd looked at the limestone wall behind the stove, not with the expression of someone delivering information strategically, with the expression of someone saying a thing because it was relevant, and because sitting in a well-built underground shelter in the middle of a catastrophic blizzard made the relevance undeniable. He mentioned it more than once over the years, he said. said there was something on the western ridge worth knowing about, said he had looked into it. The fire moved in the stove behind the iron door. Drift shifted in his sleep against the far wall. He never said anything to me, Nora said. Dodd nodded once slowly. He looked at her with the directness of someone who understood that the next thing he said would matter and chose not to blunt it. That was his way, he said, with the things he thought you needed to find for yourself. Nora held that without responding for a moment. Outside the hill, the blizzard pressed its full weight against the ridge and found no purchase. The stone and the earth and the careful design of a man who had built this place from grief and understanding absorbed the pressure and returned nothing. She added a piece of cedar to the fire. She checked the draft. She checked the ventilation. She wrote the day's inventory count in the ledger with the carpenter's pencil stub, adding a new column for the current population and the revised daily consumption rate. Around her, the people in the shelter settled into the rhythms of the eighth day underground. Agnes Waller portioned out the morning meal with the quiet precision she had developed over the past several days. Wren sat near Drift with her legs crossed and her eyes half closed in the way of a child who had decided the old gray dog was the most reliable object in her current world and had organized herself accordingly. Clarence Pruitt checked the wood stack and moved 3 fresh pieces to the drying position near the warm wall without being asked. Mabel Pruitt brought Earl Dodd's wife a jar of warm water with a strip of salt pork floated in it, which was the closest approximation to broth that the shelter's supplies allowed. Harlan Voss sat in his corner and contributed nothing additional and took nothing additional, and seemed to have arrived at the understanding that this was the available arrangement. The shelter ran, not perfectly, correctly. That evening, after the fire had settled and most of the shelter's population had drifted into sleep, Nora sat near the stove with the ledger open across her knees and reread the section where Elias had described the failure of his first shelter. The bad draft, the man who did not wake, the name he could not write without wanting to destroy the page. She understood something about that now that she had not fully understood on the first reading. Elias had not built this shelter because he was skilled. He had built it because he was afraid of what happened when skill was insufficient. The skill came after the fear. The shelter was the answer to a question that cost him more than he had wanted to pay for the asking of it. She turned to the page she had written in on the first night. I found this place. I will keep it. She read it once, then she added a second line beneath it. 7 people and 1 dog, everyone warm, inventory holding. She closed the ledger. The candle burned low. The stove held its heat. The hill held everything else. By the 10th day, Nora's mornings had a shape her body knew before her mind caught up. Wood first, then draft, then the shafts, then the trench. She had done it enough times that the shelter told her what it needed before she had to ask. That morning it needed what it always needed. She gave it that and moved on. Earl Dodd found her in the rear alcove not long after first light, crouched beside the drainage trench with a candle in one hand and the trenching spade in the other, clearing a section near the sump that had developed a small collapse overnight. He watched her work for a moment before speaking. That was something she had come to appreciate about the man. He did not fill silence with noise simply because silence was available to be filled. Storm is not breaking, he said. She knew that. She had climbed to the door twice in the past day and opened it enough to read the conditions outside. The wind had not decreased. The temperature had not risen. If anything, the snowfall had intensified in a way that suggested the system had stalled somewhere above the valley, rather than moving through it, as storms in this region typically did. How long can the food hold? Dodd asked. She stood up and set the spade against the wall. She had run the calculation the evening before and again in her head during the early morning hours, when she lay awake listening to the shelter perform its slow, steady work around her. At current population and current ration, she said we have between 11 and 13 days. That is if nothing spoils and nothing is wasted. Dodd was quiet for a moment. We need to cut rations, he said. Not a suggestion, an observation. The statement of a man who had been doing practical math in difficult situations for a long time and had learned to say the answer without softening the edges off it. By a quarter, she said, starting today. He nodded. Then he looked at the wall behind her for a moment with the particular expression he sometimes carried, the expression of a man holding something in the middle distance that was not visible to anyone else in the room. Your father was a careful man, he said. She looked at him. Not careful the way cautious men are careful, Dodd said. Careful the way men are when they have thought something through fully and are certain enough of their thinking to act on it without explaining the action. He let that sit for a moment. He would ride out to this ridge. I saw him do it twice over the years. Once in late fall, once in early spring. Never said much about it when he came back. Just that there was something on the western ridge worth a man's attention. Nora was still. He knew about this place, she said. Dodd looked at her directly. I believe he did, yes. She thought about that for a moment. She thought about the 12 years she had spent on that farm. Every season, every repair, every early morning and late evening. Her father moving through all of those years beside her, working with the particular focused quietness of a man who communicated through labor rather than language. He never said a word to me about it, she said. Dodd looked at his hands briefly. No, he said. I don't imagine he did. He looked up again. Your father was not a man who handed people things he believed they needed to earn. He was not hard about it. He was not withholding in the way of a man who wanted to control what others had. He was specific about it. He believed there was a difference between giving someone a tool and letting them find the tool. He thought the finding was part of what made the tool worth having. Nora looked at the wall of the alcove, the packed earth, the cedar shoring, the careful work of a man long dead who had decided that understanding was worth more than comfort and had built that belief into stone and wood and drainage angles. He left me here to find, she said. Not quite a question. Dodd said nothing for a moment. Then he said, that is how I read it. Yes. She picked up the candle from the ledge where she had set it. The flame was steady in the still air of the alcove. He could have just told me, she said. Her voice carried something she did not try to conceal and did not try to amplify. Simply what was there. He could have. Dodd agreed. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had weight in it. Then he said, some men leave maps. Your father left terrain. She took that with her back to the main chamber and did not speak further about it for the rest of the morning. The ration reduction was announced at the common meal and received without significant protest. Agnes Waller adjusted the portions with the precise efficiency of a woman for whom the management of limited resources was not a new problem. Wren ate her reduced share without comment, which Nora suspected reflected both the child's inherent temperament and the understanding she had developed over the past 10 days about what the situation actually was. Harlan Voss said nothing. He had said very little about anything since the cash incident. He occupied his corner, performed the task assigned to him, and collected his meals without the additional negotiation he had attempted in the first week. Clarence Pruitt asked about the storm's likely duration with the practical directness of a man who needed information to plan rather than to worry, and Nora told him honestly that she did not know. The system had stalled. Stalled systems in this region could resolve in 2 days or in 7. There was no reliable way to calculate which. What they could control was what they were already controlling. The rest was the mountain's decision. Pruitt nodded at that and went back to his woodworking project, a small repair he had undertaken on one of the shelf brackets that had cracked under load using tools from the alcove wall, and proceeding with the methodical care of someone doing useful work, because useful work was the best available response to a situation that could not be resolved by will alone. On the 11th day, Nora found the plane. She had not been looking for it. She had been in the far back corner of the rear alcove behind the last barrel, checking the floor in that area for moisture seepage that she had suspected might be developing along the base of the rear wall. She was on her hands and knees with the candle close to the ground when the light caught something that did not match the uniform texture of the packed earth floor. A seam, not a crack, not a settling line, not the kind of natural separation that old packed earth developed over seasons of freeze and thaw. A seam with corners, Right angles again, nature's least favorite shape. The shape that announced human intention, the way a signature announced authorship. She set the candle on a barrel and used the flat of her knife to probe the edge of the seam. The earth came away in a clean line. Not fallen earth filling a natural gap. Cut earth compressed back into position around a frame. A fitted frame cedar again from the smell of the disturbed material. Set into the alcove floor and covered over with a layer of packed dirt that had been matched to the surrounding surface with enough care that it had remained undetected through her nearly 2 weeks of daily inspections. She cleared the frame edge and found the recessed pull a small iron ring set flush into the wood and folded flat against the surface. She lifted the ring and pulled. A shallow box, perhaps 4 inches deep and 18 inches across, cedar-lined, fitted with a lid that had been sealed around its edge with the same rendered fat wax she had found on the food jar lids. The wax seal was intact, not old in the way the ledger was old. The wax still had a faint color that suggested a shorter exposure to the underground air than the decades the shelter itself had been present. She held the candle over the box and looked at what was inside. A hand plane. Carpenter's plane, the Bailey pattern kind that serious woodworkers carried and maintained and considered a primary tool in the way that other craftsmen considered their most precise instrument primary. The iron was clean, no rust protected by a coating of linseed oil that was still effective and still slightly tacky to the touch. The wooden body was dark with the absorbed oils of years of regular handling. The particular warm darkness that wood developed only through consistent contact with working hands over a long time. She lifted it out of the box carefully, turned it over. On the underside of the toe, stamped into the wood with a small letter stamp in the compressed way of a man who marked his tools against the possibility of loss, were 2 letters and a number. J.R. and below that 7. Joseph Reed. Her father's first initial and the last name she carried, and the number 7, which was the mark he had used on all his personal tools to distinguish them from the farm tools held in common. She had grown up around the number 7 on the handles of chisels and the stems of squares and the ends of planes. It was as familiar to her as his handwriting, as familiar to her as his voice had been, as familiar as the sound of him moving through the house before dawn on a cold morning. The particular cadence of a man who had been doing the same things in the same order for so long that he moved through his own life without needing to think about it. She sat back against the barrel behind her and held the plane in both hands. Her father had been here. Not just heard about this place from a distance. Not just ridden out to confirm its existence from the hillside. He had come inside. He had been in this alcove. He had brought tools and he had worked, and he had left his tools here in the way a craftsman left tools in a place he intended to return to, which was carefully and protected and in a position of readiness rather than storage. He had been maintaining this shelter. She looked at the cedar shoring along the walls of the alcove, the clean joints where the support posts met the horizontal braces. She looked at the drainage trench with its careful grade and its neatly cut sides. She had assumed all of it was Elias Croft's original work. She had dated it by the age of the ledger and the darkness of the iron hardware and the settled quality of the construction. But cedar shoring did not stay clean-jointed for 50 years without someone replacing what deteriorated. Drainage trenches did not hold their grade through season after season without someone clearing and recut what collapsed. Her father had been here repeatedly, had kept what Elias built from becoming what the first shelter had become, had sustained it without telling anyone it needed sustaining or that he was the one doing it. She thought about Elias Croft, who had built this place from the grief of a man who had lost someone to an error he could have prevented if he had understood better. And she thought about her father who had found this place and had understood what it was and had quietly continued what Elias had started without any acknowledgement and without any record except the tools he left and the work those tools had done on the wood and stone around her. She sat in the alcove for a long time. The candle burned. The shelter performed its continuous quiet work around her, not because the design was perfect and required nothing, because someone had cared for the design faithfully and anonymously and without requiring acknowledgement for the caring. She thought about what Earl Dodd had said. Some men leave maps. Your father left terrain. She understood that differently now. He had not just left her a place to find. He had left her a place he had been quietly preparing for her to find. The preparation was itself the message. The message was in the maintained shoring, in the clean trench and the wax seal over the plane that kept rust from touching the iron, and the number 7 stamped into the toe of the tool that said, without words, this belongs to someone specific, and that person is you. She carried the plane back to the main chamber and sat near the stove. She set it on the shelf beside the ledger. The two objects sat together in the candlelight, Elias Croft's careful record of what he had understood and lost and rebuilt, and Joseph Reed's carpenter's plane that had spent years working on what Elias had built. Maintaining a continuity between a man who died in 1876 and a woman who had walked through a blizzard in 1888 and found a door in a hill because her dog refused to go the other direction. Earl Dodd looked at the plane from across the chamber. He looked at Nora. He said nothing. Some recognitions did not require commentary. That evening, Ruth Reed arrived. Nora heard the knock and climbed the stairs and opened the door, and Ruth was standing there on the hillside in the dark, with snow driving horizontally across the narrow beam of the lantern she held in front of her. Behind her were two men, the hired hands who had been keeping the Reed farm from coming apart through the winter. Both of them bent under the weight of cold and the particular look of people who had been managing a deteriorating situation for too long and had finally reached the limit of what holding together was possible. Ruth looked at Nora across the threshold. She did not speak immediately. She looked at her stepdaughter's face the way a person looked at a face they had known for years in a context that was entirely altered, trying to read the familiar features against an unfamiliar situation. The lantern light was not flattering to either of them. It showed the cold and the exhaustion and the weeks of hard weather and the 12 years of complicated distance that had existed between them and now existed in a new form here on a hillside, in a blizzard beside a door in the ground. The north roof came down, Ruth said. Her voice was steady. She did not ask. She did not explain further than that. She simply stated the condition and let it stand. Nora stepped back from the doorway. Come down, she said. Ruth and the two men descended into the shelter. The hired hands, she knew them as Ames and Cordell, both in their 30s, and both carrying the look of men who had been working a property under increasingly impossible conditions and had finally reached the limit of what was possible. They came into the warmth of the chamber and stood there with the temporary speechlessness that the change of conditions sometimes produced. The bodies paused before it began the business of recovering from what it had been enduring. Ruth stood near the entrance to the main chamber and looked at the shelter, the way she looked at everything with the evaluating attention of a woman who processed the world through the question of how things were organized and whether that organization made sense. She looked at the food shelves, the stove and its precise positioning against the limestone wall, the sleeping areas laid out along the outer walls, the ventilation arrangement that kept the air clean and circulating despite the number of people occupying the space. Her eyes moved to the shelf beside the stove. She saw the ledger. She saw the plane beside it. Something crossed her face that Nora could not fully name. It was not guilt exactly. It was not grief exactly. It was the expression of a person confronting evidence of a truth they had known about, but had not allowed themselves to hold directly for a long time, and were now holding directly because the evidence was in front of them, and looking away was no longer available as a strategy. She looked at Nora. He came here, Ruth said, quietly. A statement, not a question. Nora said yes. Ruth looked at the plane again. A long look. The kind of look that covered more time than the immediate moment that moved back through years and across distances and through the particular silences that had existed in a farmhouse kitchen between a woman and a girl who had never quite found the common language that might have made them something other than strangers inside the same walls. He kept it from you, Ruth said. Nora considered that for a moment. Not in the way you mean, she said. He kept it for me. There is a difference. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the people near the stove, who were pretending not to listen, had time to stop pretending and simply listen. Long enough that the fire shifted once and the draft changed briefly and settled again. Long enough that Drift lifted his head from beside the stove and looked at the two women and then lowered it again with the quiet judgment of an animal that had decided this was a human matter and they could manage it. Then Ruth said, "He left you something else?" Her voice had changed. It had lost the steady practical quality that she used as the surface texture of most of her speech, and underneath it was something older and less managed. There is a document with Alderman Birch in Caldwell Crossing, filed the week before he got sick. I knew about it. I did not tell you. Nora looked at her steadily. Ruth met the look without looking away, which was something. The midsection of the western parcel, she said, from the limestone ridge down to the creek line. He filed it separate from the farm deed. Your name, not the farm, just that parcel, the parcel where the shelter sat. Ruth did not offer anything further, and Nora did not ask for it. The truth had been placed between them on the ground the same way difficult truths always got placed in this country, without ceremony, without the softening that would have made it easier to receive and also somehow less true in the receiving. A thing said plainly was a thing that could not be unsaid and could not be argued against. Ruth had said it plainly. That took something. Nora recognized it took something and filed that recognition without comment. Nora said, "There is space along the far wall." She said it to Ruth the same way she had said it to Agnes Waller and to Gideon Falk and to Clarence and Mabel Pruitt. Matter-of-factly, without warmth and without coldness. With the particular register of a person managing a shelter in a blizzard for whom the personal history attached to any given arrival was secondary to the immediate practical requirement of getting another cold person into warmth. She handed Ruth's hired hands each a blanket from the supply stack and directed them to sleeping positions. She showed Ruth where the food inventory was posted and explained the ration system and the meal schedule. She explained the fire discipline and the clothing arrangement and the ventilation check rotation. Ruth listened with complete attention and did not interrupt and did not offer alternative suggestions. And when Nora was finished, she simply nodded once the sharp, economical nod of a practical woman who had been given a clear operational briefing and had no objections to its content. That was enough. The following morning, Ruth was awake before Agnes Waller and had already begun sorting the food inventory by the freshness markers on the jar wax before Agnes arrived to manage the morning meal. The two women worked side by side in the narrow space between the shelves and the stove, with the functional cooperation of people who understood that the work needed to happen, and the work could happen more efficiently with two than with one. Nothing else was discussed. Nora watched them for a moment from across the chamber and then went to check the ventilation shafts and said nothing about what she had noticed. 3 more people arrived on the 12th day. A widow from the south edge of the valley with her 2 adult sons who had been trying to manage a grain operation through the blizzard and had lost the battle comprehensively when their storage shed collapsed under accumulated snow weight. They came in with the particular hollowness of people who had just watched months of work destroyed in an afternoon, and they sat near the stove for a long time before they were ready to speak about anything. Nora fed them. She showed them where to sleep. She added their food contributions to the communal inventory and adjusted the ration calculation. She did not comment on what had happened to their shed. She did not need to. They understood what had happened to their shed. What they needed was not analysis, but function. The shelter took them in. The stove continued its steady work. The limestone wall behind it continued its slow release of stored warmth into the chamber air. The ventilation moved clean and correct. The drainage carried moisture away from the floor, the way Elias had designed it to carry moisture, and the way her father had maintained the channel to keep it carrying. 23 people total at the shelter's peak population. Nora ran the arithmetic every evening before sleep. She ran it honestly without rounding in either direction. She ran it as Elias Croft would have run it as a man who had learned that optimism was not the appropriate response to a situation that required accuracy. The food would hold. Reduced rations carefully managed the shelter's population could be sustained through an additional 12 days beyond what the storm was currently indicating. not comfortably, adequately. Adequacy was what winter offered when it was in a generous mood, and Nora had learned not to refuse adequacy on the grounds that she would have preferred something better. On the morning of the 14th day, Nora climbed the stairs before dawn and cracked the door without fully opening it. The wind had stopped, not diminished, stopped. The complete absence of the horizontal force that had been the constant auditory and physical backdrop to every moment of the past 2 weeks was so total that it registered in her body as a physical change in pressure. She stood at the cracked door and held still and listened to a silence that was genuinely silent in the way that only post-storm silence could be, every surface covered and muffled and the air itself emptied of movement. She opened the door fully. The sky above the ridge was the deep violet gray of very early morning before the first light separated itself from the darkness. The snow covering the hillside was unmarked in every direction. She could see a surface that no wind had disturbed since the storm ended, smooth and complete and faintly luminous in the pre-dawn light. The pine trees above the shelter entrance stood still for the first time in 2 weeks. No movement in the branches, no sound of needles against the wind. Just trees standing in the way. Trees were supposed to stand, without effort, without survival, simply present. Drift came up the stairs and stood beside her in the opening. He did not need to go far. He stepped out onto the snow surface and lifted his nose into the still cold air and took a long reading of whatever information the world was currently offering. Then he turned back and looked at Nora with the expression he wore when he had assessed a situation and found it acceptable. She stood there for a long time. The first light, when it came, was pale gold at the eastern edge of the valley, filtering across the snow-covered floor of Black Hollow in a way that made the entire landscape look new, which it was in a sense. The storm had remade the visible surface of the world. Fence lines were buried. The wagon road to Caldwell Crossing was gone beneath 4-foot drifts in the places where the terrain had funneled the blowing snow. The buildings visible from the ridge, the cluster of structures at the north end of the valley, showed the particular posture of structures that had been tested hard and had answered with varying degrees of success. She could see from the ridge that 2 roof lines sat wrong. The collapsed sections showed as dark interruptions in the white. Other buildings stood intact, but with the compressed, burdened look of walls and roofs that had held but had done so at the outer limit of what their construction allowed. Below the ridge and inside the hill behind her, the shelter was unchanged. She went back down. The news of the storm's end moved through the chamber before she announced it. People had felt the silence the same way she had, the body's recognition of an absence that had been present so long it had become structural. Agnes Waller was already folding blankets. Clarence Pruitt was checking the inventory against what remained with the methodical purpose of a man preparing to transition from one operational mode to another. Wren was awake and sitting near Drift with both hands in his fur and her face carrying the particular brightness of a child for whom the world had just reopened. They came out into the light one at a time. The cold was still serious, the kind of deep cold that settled after a major system had exhausted itself and left the air clean and still and brutally honest about temperature. But still, cold and moving cold were entirely different animals, and everyone who stepped out of the shelter entrance onto the snow-covered hillside recognized the difference immediately in their face and their lungs and the way their body organized itself against the temperature without the additional labor of bracing against wind. Earl Dodd stood on the hillside for a long moment looking down at the valley. He looked at it with the expression of a man professionally accounting for damage, cataloging what he could see from the elevation, and beginning the mental work of what the next weeks would require of him and the community he was responsible for. He looked back at the shelter entrance and at the vent pipe above the hill from which a thin column of smoke still rose into the clear, cold air, controlled and steady, exactly as it had risen every day for the past 2 weeks. He looked at Nora. He said, "This place saved lives, more than we will probably know how to count." She said, "Elias Croft saved lives. My father kept the work alive. I just found the door." Dodd looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "That is the third part of the thing, the finding. Without that, the other 2 don't matter." She did not argue with him. She simply went back inside and began the work of closing the shelter properly for the immediate transition. Food inventory documented with final counts. Tools returned to their wall positions. The drainage trench given a final clearing. The stove reduced to a maintenance burn rather than a working fire banked carefully so that the coals would hold for days without requiring fuel available immediately if the shelter needed to be reactivated. She did all of it the way Elias had described doing all of it in the ledger, without ceremony, without shortcuts, the way it was meant to be done. The weeks that followed the blue darkness of 1888 did not produce heroes in Black Hollow in the way that stories sometimes required. No speeches were given at a town gathering. No formal acknowledgement was organized by the county. The valley was too exhausted and too busy with recovery for that kind of ceremony, and the people who had lived through it were too practical to mistake survival for achievement. They had made it. They needed to get back to work. Those two facts occupied most of the available attention. But something had shifted in the way the valley understood winter. Clarence Pruitt dug his new root cellar twice as deep as the one he had been using and raised every storage barrel off the floor on limestone blocks before he put a single item of food inside. He installed a ventilation shaft with the same offset design Elias had used, running it at an angle through the earthen ceiling so that cold air entered at a low point and warm, stale air escaped at a high point without the two streams interfering with each other. He asked Nora to look at it before he covered it over. She made two suggestions. He implemented both without discussion. Gideon Falk rebuilt the storage shed behind his trapping cabin with the back wall set into the hillside, rather than standing free using the earth as the fourth wall, the way Elias had used it, reducing his exposed surface area by a quarter, and immediately noticing the difference in how long the interior held its temperature between fires. He told 3 other trappers what he had done and why, and 2 of them rebuilt their sheds before the following autumn. Agnes Waller organized a conversation among the women of the valley's creekside cabins about food storage and moisture management that was practical rather than social. A comparison of what had failed during the storm and what had held, conducted with the directness of people who had recently learned the cost of inadequate preparation and intended to change the calculus before the next winter arrived. She invited Nora to speak at one of these conversations. Nora came and answered the questions she was asked with the same directness Agnes had used to invite her. No one called it Nora's system. It was not Nora's system. It was Elias Croft's system, refined by Joseph Reed over years of quiet maintenance and proven by a 2-week blizzard against which it had been tested completely and had not failed. Nora was simply the person who had been present for the testing and who could explain the principles clearly enough that others could apply them. She explained them when asked. She was asked often. Earl Dodd processed the land document with Alderman Birch in Caldwell Crossing 3 weeks after the storm. The western parcel from the Limestone Ridge to the creek line was transferred into Nora's name with the particular efficient lack of ceremony that legal documentation in frontier counties was processed. She signed the paper. The clerk witnessed it. The document joined the county record. The farm remained Ruth's. That was the legal truth, and Nora held it honestly, because holding truths honestly was the only way to live with them rather than under them. Ruth managed the property with the competence she had always managed it, which was real competence, whatever else was complicated between them. The land would not be neglected under her stewardship. That was something. In hard country, competent stewardship of land was not a small thing. It was close to the largest thing there was. She and Ruth did not become friends. That was not the kind of story they were in. But in the spring, when Nora was repairing a section of fence along the boundary between the western parcel and the farm, Ruth came out with 2 cups of coffee and set one on the post beside Nora without a word and stood there for a few minutes looking at the fence work. Then she went back inside. It was not reconciliation. It was not forgiveness. It was 2 practical women standing near the same fence line in the same cold spring air and agreeing without saying so that the fence needed to be right and the coffee was adequate and the rest of it could be whatever it was going to be. That was enough. In the kind of country they lived in, that was often as much as anything got to be. In the early spring, before the snow melt had fully finished its work on the ridge, Nora walked up to the shelter entrance on the first morning that felt genuinely like thaw rather than merely a pause in winter. Drift walked beside her at the loose-leash pace he used when no particular urgency was in play, the pace of an old dog moving through familiar ground on a good day. His gray-brown coat showed the white hairs at the muzzle and the slight softening around the eyes that marked the later years of a working dog's life. He moved without difficulty. He had earned the right to move at whatever pace suited him. She went inside. She lit a candle not because she needed light for any task, but because the shelter felt right with a candle rather than without one. The smell of the place met her at the bottom of the stairs the way it always did. Packed earth, old cedar, the ghost of smoke from a winter's worth of careful fires, the faint mineral quality of the limestone wall. She had spent 2 weeks underground in this place, and the smell of it had become as familiar to her as the smell of the farmhouse she had grown up in, and considerably more comforting than the farmhouse had felt for the last several years she had lived in it. She went to the shelf beside the stove and looked at the two objects that had been sitting there since the morning she found the plane in the alcove. Elias Croft's ledger, her father's hand plane. She picked up the ledger and opened it to the final pages. Her own entries were there, the population counts and the ration calculations, and the maintenance notes she had kept through the 2 weeks of the storm in the same compressed practical hand she had been using since she first picked up Elias's carpenter's pencil. She read back through them the way she read back through any record, not with sentiment, but with assessment, looking for what the numbers said about how the shelter had performed and how the decisions she had made had affected that performance, and what she would do differently if the situation repeated. The numbers were honest. The shelter had performed. The decisions had been correct not because she had special knowledge, but because she had read Elias carefully and applied what he had understood with the practical attention it deserved. The finding, as Dodd had said, was the third part of the thing. But the reading was what had made the finding worth anything. I found this place. I will keep it. 7 people and 1 dog. Everyone warm. Inventory holding. She found the pencil stub in the shelf niche where she always kept it. She turned to the next blank page. The storm held for 14 days. The shelter held through all of them. 23 people at peak count. No deaths, no serious injuries. Food inventory reached approximately 40% remaining at storm's end. She paused. She looked at the shelf beside the stove where the plane sat beside the ledger, the linseed oil on the iron still faintly tacky in the cool underground air. The number 7 on the toe as clear and deliberate as the day her father had pressed it there. Then she wrote a final line. The hill kept what it covered. That is still the answer. That has always been the answer. She closed the ledger. She set it back on the shelf. She set the hand plane beside it the way she had found them close together in the record of understanding and the evidence of work that had kept the understanding alive, one incomplete without the other. She positioned them with care, not with sentiment, but with the same attention she gave to anything that was going to be on a shelf for a long time and needed to be placed in a way that meant it would still be there and still be intact for whoever came next. Because there would be a whoever came next. She understood that now in a way she had not fully understood before the blizzard. The shelter was not a discovery. It was a link in a chain that Elias Croft had forged in grief and her father had maintained in silence, and she had found in desperation and held intact through a hard 2 weeks. The chain did not end with her. The chain ended when the last person who understood why it mattered failed to pass the understanding forward, and she did not intend to be that person. She stood near the cold stove for a moment in the quiet of the empty shelter. The air was dry and still and carried that particular smell she had come to know as completely as she knew the smell of cedar wood or harness oil or frost-covered pine needles in early morning. A place had a smell when it was maintained with attention, and she had given this place attention, and the smell of it was now the smell of something cared for. She climbed the stairs. Drift was waiting at the top, sitting beside the open door in the thin spring sunlight, his face angled toward the warmth with the uncomplicated appreciation of an old dog who had decided the sun was a good thing and intended to be present for it. He had done his work. He had led her where she needed to go on the night that leading her there had mattered most. He had done it without explanation and without reward, and without requiring that she understand immediately what he had understood before she did. He had simply gone the right direction and waited for her to follow. And when she had followed, he had taken her to the door, and the door had held everything that came after. She sat beside him on the snow-crusted hillside above the shelter entrance. Below them, the valley of Black Hollow was beginning its slow emergence from the white compression the storm had imposed on it. Fences that would need rebuilding, fields that would need clearing, structures that needed repair or replacement. All the work of returning to a working life after a winter that had tested everything and been honest about what it found. The valley would carry the marks of this winter for years. Some of the marks would be visible in the rebuilt fences and the newly deepened root cellars and the ventilation shafts that appeared in storage sheds across the property lines. Some of the marks would be less visible in the way people thought about preparation and depth, and the difference between a wall that faced winter and a wall that was held by the earth itself. From above the entrance, the vent pipe released a thin line of smoke into the morning air. Not from a fire she had built. The coals she had banked before leaving had held through the night the way good coals held when they were managed with the understanding of what they were trying to do, and now they were releasing their last warmth upward through the channel that Elias Croft had positioned with such precision that 50 years of Wyoming winters had not improved on the angle. The smoke rose straight in the still morning air, thin, controlled, alive. Nora looked at it for a moment. She looked at it the way you looked at something that contained more history than it appeared to contain from the outside. A thin line of smoke that was also the continuation of a decision made by a grieving man. In the spring of 1873, maintained by a quiet man across the better part of 2 decades and carried forward by a woman who had walked into a blizzard with a flour sack and a dog and the unwashed scarf of her dead father and had found, under 3 feet of packed snow on a limestone ridge in Wyoming, the place that had been waiting for her to find it. She looked out across the valley at the work that was waiting, the way it always waited in this country, without impatience and without mercy, simply present and requiring the person looking at it to decide what they were going to do about it. Drift leaned his weight against her leg. She put her hand on his back and felt the steady warmth of him in the morning cold. The particular living warmth of a working animal that had done what it came to do and was now resting in the thin spring sun with the completeness of a creature that had nothing left to prove. Then she stood up and went to work.